Chapter 41 Death Vulture, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. As the last shadows of dawn retreated before the blazing sunrise, Colonel Fernando, commander of the 4th Air Force of German Army Group South, and his squadron finally arrived at the stalemated front lines, before inventions like night vision and advanced airborne radar became standard on fighter planes. Night flights were incredibly risky. That's why Colonel Fernando, back at the airport, was so frustrated when he received Dietrich's plea for air support. All he could do was stare at the misty, pre-dawn sky, and sigh. He paced the headquarters like a caged tiger for 10 agonizing minutes. As soon as the sun provided enough light for takeoff, a thoroughly impatient Colonel Fernando wired back Dietrich's headquarters, then personally led the sortie, gripping the controls of his Bf-109E3 fighter, marked with the wing leader's insignia. He climbed to 3,000 meters. He subtly adjusted the joystick, glancing down at the landscape. With his sharp eyesight, Colonel Fernando could clearly identify his location just outside the town of Broad, already consumed by war and smoke. Realizing the dire situation, Fernando, barely pausing to consider his old friend's safety, slammed the joystick forward, leading his 50-plus warplanes into a screaming dive. This squadron, part of the 4th Air Force, primarily deployed two types of aircraft for ground attacks. The first was the Ju-87B-2 Stuka dive bomber, nicknamed Death Vulture. The primary ground support aircraft, making up 38 of the attacking force. The other type, comprising the remaining 20 aircraft, was the Bf-109E3 fighter, the backbone of the Luftwaffe's air superiority. Though the Luftwaffe's Operation Barbarossa had initially crippled the Soviet Air Force, destroying almost all their planes on the ground and securing air supremacy, the meticulous Germans didn't let their guard down. To ensure the safety of their vulnerable Stuka dive bombers, the Luftwaffe always provided fighter escorts during ground attacks, but it would be wrong to assume the Bf-109E3 fighters, acting as bodyguards, lacked ground attack capabilities themselves. The E3 variant, the latest in the Bf-109 line, featured an external bomb rack under the fuselage. Powered by a Daimler-Benz DB601A 12-cylinder, inline, water-cooled engine producing 990 horsepower, the Bf-109E3 could carry a 250 kg bomb for ground attack missions. Screaming down, he locked onto his target and released the bomb. The 250 kg bomb, packed with 125 kg of TNT, hurtled towards the Soviet troops below, who were like lambs to the slaughter, defenseless against aerial attack. Boom. Even these smaller 250 kg bombs packed a punch. The 125 kg of TNT inside these bombs packed roughly 18 times the punch of the 8 kg TNT warhead found in a 152 mm KV-2 heavy tank shell. Even the massive B-4 203 mm howitzer, with its 17 kg of TNT, paled in comparison, delivering only about 1/7 of the explosive power of the German aircraft bomb. When these devastating bombs slammed into the center of the Soviet formation, the tightly packed infantry and tanks simply vanished. In a maelstrom of fire and explosions, like a bite taken out of a cake, after his initial dive, he quickly pulled up. Not satisfied with one hit, Colonel Fernando executed a perfect roll and dove again from less than 1,000 meters. Rat-a-tat-tat. The two MGFF 20mm wing-mounted cannons, designed for air combat, now became instruments of brutal ground assault. These 20mm cannons were far more powerful than any modern anti-material rifle. The scene as they tore into flesh was horrifying. Amidst the spray of blood, screams erupted, mixed with the relentless chatter of the machine guns. The Soviet infantry, caught in the path of the 20mm cannons and the two 92mm machine guns in the nose, were torn apart. Limbs were severed by the powerful shells, flung far and wide. Even more gruesome was the sight of soldiers, cut in half by the cannons, dragging their blue-gray intestines across the ground, crawling and screaming like demons from hell. Chapter 42 Death Vulture, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The nightmare had only just begun, and there was no end in sight. After completing another strafing run, Colonel Fernando yanked his plane upward. The Stukas, slower than his Bf-109E3, finally caught up. The first wave of 3 Ju-87B-2 Stuka dive bombers plunged from the sky, their sirens screaming their signature death wail. Three 250-kilogram bombs hurtled towards the disorganized Soviet formation in a triangular pattern, boom boom boom. The Soviet 20th Tank Division, with its 2 armored regiments and 1 mechanized infantry regiment, was hammered again. The lighter BT series fast tanks and T-26 light tanks were rocked by the shockwaves. The KV-2 heavy tanks, targeted by the German Stuka pilots, were pummeled by dozens of 152 mm shells and 250 kg bombs. The explosion sent flames and smoke towering over 100 feet into the air. Caught in the violent German air attack, Malyshenko felt like a small boat tossed in a stormy sea. His ears rang, his vision blurred, and he barely had time to react when a barrage of artillery fire erupted from their left flank, boom boom boom. Whitman, through his commander's periscope, watched the results of the ranging shots, observing every detail from firing to impact. He turned to his gunner, clink. That shot was a little high, clink. The T-34's side armor is sloped. Lower the gun 1 degree and aim for the tracks. There's no slope there. Got it, understood. Armor-piercing rounds. Clink adjusted the gun according to Whitman's instructions, then, hearing the loader's call, fired 2 75mm armor-piercing rounds at the T-34 tanks bearing down on them. Before Operation Barbarossa, German armored forces hadn't fully adapted to face the T-34 medium tanks and KV series heavy tanks. The Stu-G3 assault gun, a frontline fire support weapon, was only equipped with a short-barreled 75mm gun. This gun couldn't penetrate a T-34 head-on. Whitman, knowing his tank was outmatched, chose a cautious ambush, waiting for the right moment. When the Soviet army was already in chaos, he gave the order to attack. Even so, the 75mm armor-piercing shell fired by the Stu-G3 could only penetrate 50mm of vertical steel armor at 500 meters. Therefore, even with the ambush, Whitman's Stu-G3 failed to penetrate the effective 60mm side armor of the T-34. The shell left only a shallow dent before ricocheting away. Having studied the wreckage of Soviet tanks, Whitman understood the principles of sloped armor. Knowing his assault gun couldn't threaten the sloped armor on the front or sides of the T-34, Whitman targeted its weakness, the vertical armor behind the tracks. For the T-34, with its comprehensive sloped armor, the vertical armor on the sides of the hull behind the tracks was only 45mm thick. For Whitman's crew, attacking from less than 300 meters, the Stu-G3, capable of penetrating 50mm of vertical steel at 500 meters, was more than capable of penetrating it. Boom. Clink fired again, and a 75mm armor-piercing projectile hit the side armor of the nearest T-34. The 45mm armor couldn't withstand the blow. After penetrating the armor, the shell detonated inside the T-34, hitting the ammunition rack. The explosion ignited dozens of 76mm shells, creating a catastrophic chain reaction. The commander and loader, who had just opened the turret hatch to escape, were blown into the air before they could even get their legs out. Seeing his plan succeed, Whitman, unable to contain his excitement, opened the radio channel and addressed the other Stu-G3 commanders. Chapter 43 All Desperate, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. You all see it, right? Do it now. Aim for the vertical armor behind the side tracks on those Soviet T-34s. That's their weak spot. Following Whitman's shouted orders, several other Stu-G3s ambushed on the hillside followed suit, lowering their guns and firing at the T-34's vulnerable sides. Suddenly, the Soviet offensive went from smooth sailing to a complete nosedive. The newly arrived 88mm anti-aircraft guns rushed to the rescue. Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and Bf-109E-3 fighter jets roared overhead, while Whitman's assault guns poured maximum firepower from the hillside flank. The German army, already seeing red, held its ground, using every weapon they had to return fire against the relentless Soviet attacks. These young SS soldiers, with their fanatical belief in Hitler, had become bloodthirsty beasts. These murderous SS soldiers wouldn't stop until the last Soviet soldier fell. Standing at his observation post, Division Commander Cherniyev, his face grim, stared through his binoculars at the near one-sided slaughter. He refused to admit defeat and this time didn't need any prompting from Commissar Petrov. He turned sharply and barked at the communications officer, "Tell the artillery in the rear, I don't want to see a single one of those German anti-tank guns firing. Use every last round, even if you burn out the barrels. Yes, Comrade Commander, Political Commissar Petrov, listening to Chernyshev's roar, worried about the front lines, felt a nagging unease. But the feeling was undefinable, leading him to remain silent. Well, let's do our best. If this is the end, at least we'll go down fighting. With Chernyshev's order to provide artillery cover, the 20th Tank Division's artillery regiment immediately re-aimed its A-19 122mm cannons and ML-20 152mm howitzers. Dozens of shells, carrying the hope of turning the tide, soared into the sky, whoosh. Incoming! Take cover! The powerful 122mm and 152mm shells landed before the SS soldiers could even react to the whistle. Shrapnel and the blast ripped through the position, instantly wiping out most of the men. The battle, which had been tilting in Germany's favor, swung back violently as the Soviet artillery joined the fight. As the German defenses outside Broad were engulfed in flying debris, the German Stuka bombers, which had been circling above, spotted the smoke and dust. Like vultures drawn to blood, they dove towards the Soviet artillery positions. Planes! German planes are coming! Gunners, to your stations! Shoot them down! The Soviet artillery crews had anticipated the air attack. Anti-aircraft units, positioned on the perimeter, were ready. They opened fire, creating a deadly curtain of flak, bang bang bang. Da-da-da. The combined anti-aircraft fire from 37mm 61K autocannons and 76mm 3K guns filled the sky with tracer rounds and bursting shells, forcing the German planes to break formation before their final dive. The Stuka dive bombers, held back by the Soviet anti-aircraft fire, didn't press the attack. They dodged the incoming shells, making way for the Bf-109E3 fighter escorts. These Bf-109E3s, responsible for protecting the vulnerable Stukas, were multi-role aircraft. Besides carrying bombs and attacking ground targets, they also had the crucial job of clearing the skies for the Stukas. The anti-aircraft fire that posed a threat to the Stukas was no match for the agile Bf-109E3 fighters. Designed for air combat, they were incredibly maneuverable. They easily outmaneuvered the Soviet anti-aircraft guns, which lacked proximity fuses. The 20 Bf-109E3 fighters on this escort mission were the most advanced available, and the pilots were elite veterans under Colonel Fernando's command. These pilots were seasoned fighters who had survived the air war over Britain. They had faced Spitfires, which were as good as, or even better than, the Bf-109. These green Soviet anti-aircraft gunners were no match for these German aces. The Bf-109s danced through the sky, dodging the anti-aircraft fire with ease. The German pilots toyed with the Soviet positions, seeing their opportunity. The remaining Bf-109E3s dove towards the Soviet anti-aircraft positions. The MGFF 20mm cannons on their wings blazed with deadly light. Chapter 44: A Desperate Move, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The screaming propellers plunged towards the earth. The Soviet anti-aircraft guns, relying on manually operated gears, were already doomed. Dong, 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 da 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 da. The combined fire of 20mm cannons and 92mm machine guns ripped through the Soviet air defense positions. Gunners who moments before had been firing at the sky were now torn apart by the sudden hail of bullets, their bodies collapsing to the ground. Tragic screams mingled with a thick, tomato sauce-like mixture of human remains splattering across the anti-aircraft guns. These guns, operating in completely open-air positions with no shielding, suffered devastating losses in the first wave of German fire. The experienced German pilots toyed with the Soviet positions, now even more vulnerable due to the gaps in their defenses. The German Bf-109E3 fighter pilots, seizing the opportunity, dove straight down into the unmanned Soviet gun emplacements. Dong, dong, dong. The last surviving crew of the 76mm anti-aircraft gun fell silent as the final burst of 20mm cannon fire echoed. The bulky Stuka dive bombers, previously vulnerable to Soviet anti-aircraft fire, now had their chance thanks to the efforts of their comrades. With a wobble of their seagull-shaped fuselages and the terrifying wail of their Jericho trumpets, they swooped down on the still-smoking Soviet artillery positions. German air raid. Stukas. Take cover, the Soviet commander, responsible for the artillery regiment of the 20th Tank Division, shouted a warning, and his men scrambled towards the nearest bunkers, following prior training to simulate avoiding air attacks to save their lives, but human legs couldn't compete with the Junkers Jumo 211D 12-cylinder engine. The Ju-87B-2 Stuka dive bombers, powered by 1,200 horsepower, were about to sow death and destruction among the Soviet artillery positions. Boom. Violent explosions shook the earth. Like Judgment Day, hit by multiple 250-kilogram bombs, the Soviet artillery position was in utter chaos. Stacks of 122mm and 152mm artillery shells, laid out in the open for faster reloading, were consumed by flames in an instant, triggering massive secondary explosions. The chain reaction ripped through the Soviet positions, a firestorm fueled by exploding ammunition. No gun emplacement remained intact. The Soviet artillerymen, who had always believed in the power of big guns, were now paying the price for stockpiling excessive ammunition in pursuit of overwhelming firepower. Anyone who hadn't witnessed the simultaneous detonation of thousands of heavy artillery shells of various calibers couldn't imagine the sheer spectacle and horror. Those Soviet artillerymen who couldn't escape in time had no chance to even scream. They were instantly incinerated by the apocalyptic fireball. After the smoke cleared, no trace remained of those who had stood there. The earth-shattering explosion rocked the forward command post of the 20th Tank Division, nearly knocking everyone off their feet. As Cherniev desperately ordered artillery fire to suppress the German front, Commissar Petrov, who had been harboring a vague unease, finally understood. What he had feared was the German air support hovering over the battlefield. "I'm such a fool. Yuri warned me to watch out for those German planes, but I stubbornly believed that the artillery of the last war would lead us to victory. So that's it. These are the weapons the Germans use to conquer Europe. The key to victory on future battlefields won't be artillery, the so-called God of War, but these iron eagles in the sky. They will change the entire face of war." Petrov struggled to remain standing, realizing that the battle, and the prospect of victory, had irrevocably shifted. Forcing himself to remain calm, he patted Commander Cherniev on the shoulder. "We can't keep doing this, Commander. Look at those German planes. We're sitting ducks out here without air cover." Cherniev, realizing that the illusion of victory was slipping away, looked equally anxious. "You don't have to tell me. I know we're helpless against those planes. But I'm a tank division commander, not an Air Force commander. You want me to give our T-34s wings, since we don't have planes or anti-aircraft defenses to match them?" As Commissar Petrov and Division Commander Cherniev panicked in the face of the overwhelming German air-ground tactics, across the battlefield, in the German forward command post, Commander Dietrich, confident of victory, gave his adjutant a final order. Chapter 45, Sword Clash, Part 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Those Soviets are toast, Alfred. Tell Diesel to get ready to launch the counterattack as planned. Time to make them pay for starting this. Division Commander Dietrich was referring to a counterattack plan against the Soviets, drawn up by General Kleist of the 1st Panzer Group. This happened as soon as the 1st Panzer Group's defensive positions were in place, under the overall command of Army Group South. The German army, always believing the best defense is a good offense, wasn't about to sit back and take it when the Soviets started pushing back. According to General Kleist's pre-war strategy, if the German defensive lines held against the initial Soviet assault, and with absolute air superiority, the entire 1st Panzer Group would unleash a devastating, large-scale armored counterattack. The Soviet troops, fresh off a failed attack against the German defenses and without time to regroup, would be crushed by the coordinated air and ground assault of the 1st Panzer Group. General Kleist, a seasoned commander, felt confident in this aggressive approach, largely due to their complete control of the skies. The trench warfare of World War I had been shattered by the German blitzkrieg tactics in previous European campaigns. The modern truth of air supremacy equals half the victory was becoming clear during World War II thanks to the cutting-edge German blitzkrieg. Dietrich, known as a close confidant of Führer Hitler, openly scorned the aristocratic Wehrmacht officers, feeling they had betrayed Kaiser Wilhelm II during World War I, leading to Germany's defeat before death. But he respected General Kleist, who, regardless of his background, couldn't be classified as part of the Junker officer corps. Dietrich, who rose through the ranks himself, from a common soldier in World War I to his current position, felt a certain kinship with his superior. Everything's unfolding exactly as Kleist predicted. If those red wine-sipping, society boy advisors around the Führer had half his foresight, dealing with these vodka-soaked Ivans would be a lot easier. He lamented silently, aware that it wasn't his place to criticize Hitler's inner circle. Tired of the inaction and idle chatter of some, Dietrich closed the book on that thought, sealing away those words that should never be uttered. On the front lines, the SS soldiers sprang into action upon receiving the counterattack order. The tank units positioned on either side of Broad immediately launched their attack. Their engines roared toward the Soviet troops, who were still reeling from the Luftwaffe's relentless bombing runs. On the open grasslands, the German tanks were quickly spotted, churning up dust as they advanced. Despite taking heavy losses from the German air raids for over 10 minutes, the Soviet 20th Tank Division hadn't lost its fighting spirit. They swung their guns around and charged straight toward the incoming German armor, under a hellish sky filled with smoke, death, and bloodshed. Two steel torrents representing different ideologies and nations, unflinching, raced towards each other. The clash was inevitable. Okay, halt. Battle stations, gunner ready. Load AP rounds, target the lead T-34s, range 1,000 meters, fire. Boom. The German tanks, equipped with a 5-man crew, boasted excellent communication, coordination, and ergonomic design. The commander barked orders and fired the first shot at the Soviet tanks closing within a kilometer. Before gun stabilizers became commonplace, World War II tanks, with their main guns mounted in the turret, were essentially mobile anti-tank guns protected by steel. Expecting precise mobile fire at high speeds was unrealistic for World War II tanks. To stop the Soviet tanks before they reached their armored columns, the German units of the SS division were forced to stop and fire. The Soviet tanks, also lacking advanced stabilization equipment, were likewise unable to fire accurately while moving at high speeds, but the Soviet armored forces, trailing the Germans in precision technology, needed to ensure their slightly less accurate sights could guide their guns on target. The Soviet tank crews pressed forward, full throttle, as they had practiced in training, continuing to close the distance before firing. Chapter 46, Sword Fight, Part 2. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ding ding. The deafening clang of the shell slamming into the tank was like the Grim Reaper's bell tolling inside the cramped T-34. The tank had just withstood another hit. Malyshenko, leading the Soviet 20th Tank Division, winced, his face flushed crimson from the wound near his eye. He yelled to Kirill on his right, armor-piercing rounds. Kirill. Hurry. Yes, but while Kirill scrambled to grab another armor-piercing shell from the rack, Malyshenko forced open his right eye, crusted with blood, and peered through the gun sight. It felt like someone had blasted gunpowder into his eye, then lit it. Gritting his teeth, he slammed his foot down on the firing pedal. Boom. The BR-350B armor-piercing shell shot out of the barrel. A moment before, the German Panzer III had been firing at Malyshenko's tank. Now, a fist-sized hole ripped through its frontal armor. The shell's delayed fuse worked perfectly, detonating the explosive inside the Panzer III's fragile hull. The explosion itself didn't destroy the tank, but the Panzer III was carrying spare ammunition. The shrapnel instantly killed nearly the entire crew in the confined space. The scorching shards pierced the tank, igniting the gasoline. Flames erupted from the hole, turning the tank into a burning metal coffin in the blink of an eye. Badly wounded but still conscious, the German tank commander, the last survivor, used his last ounce of strength to force open the hatch above him, his arm riddled with shrapnel. He tried to escape the inferno. Damn it, open. Boom. Before he could finish, an explosion ripped into the sky. The tank's turret, blown off by the ignited ammunition, soared dozens of feet into the air before crashing back down. Inside the burning turret, coated in soot and gasoline residue, a large, crimson stain was all that remained, a grim testament to a desperate struggle for life. This wasn't an isolated incident on the battlefield. The Soviet T-34s roared forward, their throttles wide open, tearing across the open fields. Like Malyshenko, the lead tanks zeroed in on the German armor, unleashing a barrage of fire. The early war German Panzer III and IV tanks were no match for the T-34s in firepower or design. They lacked the sloped armor of the Soviet tanks. Their armor was thin and boxy. Against the T-34's 76mm gun, the results were predictably devastating. As for the obsolete German 35T, 38T, and the Panzer I and II light tanks, expecting them to hold their own against the Soviet armored juggernaut was a fool's dream. Sending these reconnaissance vehicles into a large-scale armored battle was suicide. The Soviet T-34's relentless firepower was proving too much for the Germans. Despite the onslaught, the Soviet tanks kept pushing forward, dealing devastating blows to the German armor. The German forces, lacking armor-piercing firepower and balanced attack defense, were on the verge of being overrun. Dietrich realized the situation was worse than he thought. He frowned. These Soviet bastards are wasting those great tanks. We can't let this continue. If they get close, our armored forces will be annihilated. Muttering to himself, Dietrich's eyes narrowed. Never one to lack resolve, he took a deep breath and turned to his adjutant. Contact Fernando in the air. Tell them to use every last round on the Soviet armor. Even those 50-kilo bombs can break their tracks and stop them. I don't care what Fernando has to do. The adjutant scribbled down Dietrich's orders on his clipboard. Once he'd confirmed everything, he dashed towards the nearby communication station. It wasn't madness or incompetence that had led Dietrich to send his armor against the powerful T-34s and KV tanks, it stemmed from his sense of duty as a member of the Führer's Guards Corps. The Führer's Guard Division, the Waffen-SS's elite unit, couldn't afford to be seen as shying away from a tank battle for fear of Soviet superiority. Dietrich, commander of the 1st Division and a close associate of the Führer, couldn't tolerate such rumors. His men, proud members of the Guards Division, were eager to take on the Soviets. Their honor demanded it, but satisfying his men's desire for a fight had backfired. Thanks to the brutal reality, the T-34s and KVs lived up to their fearsome reputation. No amount of experience or tactical skill could compensate for the German tanks' inferiority in overall quality. In a large-scale battle, individual ability could only go so far. Reluctant and somewhat ashamed, Dietrich had no choice but to call on the Luftwaffe to end the doomed fight. Chapter 47. You are listening at novelfull.audio. After Dietrich radioed for help, the German attack group, with enough fuel for extended airtime, immediately dove again towards the Soviet tanks. Bombs rained down on the Soviet armor with a horrifying, whistling shriek. The Soviet tankers, who had previously enjoyed a numerical advantage, were now desperately clinging to this lifeline. The Soviets are pulling back. Let's cut them off. We gotta chew them up. With the aid of Stuka dive bombers and Bf-109E3 fighters, the previously struggling German armor now had the support they needed. The German commander quickly ordered a pincer movement, their signature tactic, aiming to encircle Malyshenko's 20th Tank Division, cutting off their retreat and forcing surrender, a potential strategic victory. Facing this classic, rapid, and brutal German pincer attack, and hammered by the combined air and ground assault, the Soviet advance faltered. The 20th Tank Division began to rout, the disintegration spreading like a virus. Clutching his binoculars, Cherniev watched the unfolding disaster from his command post. His hands trembled, unable to process such a devastating turn. He couldn't imagine how to explain this to his superiors. He was speechless. He couldn't utter a word at this critical juncture. Petrov, seeing his partner's despair and realizing the situation was beyond saving, stepped forward with a sigh. Comrade Division Commander, we have to pull back. This battle is lost. Cherniev was stunned by Petrov's unusually defeatist tone. Retreat? Are you out of your mind, Peter? We're on the verge of collapse, and you want me to withdraw now? If I didn't know you better, Peter, I'd think you were betraying your oath as a party member and a soldier. Enough. Petrov, chest heaving and face red, roared, cutting off Cherniev. "Comrade Commander, look. Look at the battlefield our soldiers are dying on. Is their blood as bright red as your cap badge? We both know this is a lost cause. Our troops are facing annihilation. Since we can't change the situation, why can't we pull back to preserve our forces? Every Red Army soldier is a precious resource of the motherland and the Soviet Union. Stalin gave us the authority to lead them to victory, not to throw them away. If we continue down this path, we are no better than criminals, murderers of our own men. Do you understand?" Faced with Petrov's passionate outburst, Cherniev, stunned but forced to admit the truth in his words, answered coldly. "Okay, I concede you have a point, Peter. But my orders from General Rokossovsky were to break through the German defenses outside Brod, ensuring our army a final victory. There is no room for debate on this. As you said, I am aware of the value of our soldiers' lives, but above all, I am a senior commander of the Red Army. For a soldier, nothing is more unforgivable than disobeying orders. Your suggestion goes against my mission, Peter. I know this throws our soldiers into the fire, but I am forced to follow orders." "You," shocked that the usually affable Cherniev could be so ruthless, Petrov, barely recognizing his old friend, spat out each word carefully. "You've changed, old friend. Do you remember fighting the white bandits and the bourgeoisie together? You weren't like this then. Have you forgotten all of that?" Petrov's piercing gaze seemed to transport them back to that era of war and idealism. He and Cherniev, bound by conviction and purpose, had been brothers in arms, fighting side by side in the same trenches, but that youthful passion had faded with time, replaced by the cold calculation of reason and choice. Cherniev composed himself, smoothing the tremor in his face. He turned away, his voice calm, as if he was discussing lunch. Chapter 48 The End. You are listening at novelfull.audio. In the Soviet 20th Tank Division's forward command post, Division Commander Cherniev, seemingly unfazed by the constant artillery fire, calmly addressed his comrade standing behind him. "It's been a long time, Peter, since we wiped out those white bandits and chased off the bourgeois invaders. How many of the old guard, the guys who fought alongside us, are even still alive? You know why I'm asking. We've all lost too much in the past, Peter, but we've learned and changed too. I don't want the same tragedies that befell our old comrades to happen to us. What's more heartbreaking than a good soldier, full of patriotic fire, dying for nothing, without recognition or justice?" He paused, a hint of unresolved thoughts in his eyes. Cherniev knew he spoke with complete sincerity, his conviction unwavering. "If it comes down to it, I'll take all the heat, old friend. This is on me, Peter. As the commanding officer, I have the right, the duty, to carry out those offensive orders, and that's all there is to it." Petrov stared, disbelief and shock etched on his face. He hadn't realized how deeply this seemingly calm old comrade in arms was burying things. Understanding Cherniev's implication, Petrov shot back. "That was ancient history. Why are you still hung up on it? We're Red Army soldiers, following Comrade Stalin. We're ready to die for the Soviet Union. You swore an oath under the party banner. This isn't a reason to dwell on the past, to imprison yourself. Snap out of it." Commissar Petrov's impassioned outburst left Commander Cherniev speechless. He just stared back, his unwavering gaze communicating his inner resolve. Time ticked by. Cherniev hadn't budged. Petrov realized his old friend had locked himself in the past and was determined to stay there. Unable to take it any longer, the political commissar spun around and headed for the field phone connecting them to 9th Mechanized Army headquarters. "What are you doing, Peter?" Without turning, Commissar Petrov snapped, "If I can't talk you out of this, maybe Commander Rokossovsky can. Someone has to stop this madness." He reached for the phone, but before he could pick it up, it rang, jarring him. What? The timing caught him completely off guard. The divisional headquarters phone, ringing at this moment. Realizing the situation might be more dire than he thought, Petrov glanced at Cherniev, who, understanding, nodded in assent, with his comrade's approval. Commissar Petrov, already guessing the call's origin, grabbed the receiver. "Hello, 20th Tank Division Headquarters, Petrov speaking." Less than a minute later, Major General Rokossovsky's order came crackling through the line. Petrov, relieved, set the phone back down as if a huge weight had been lifted. "Looks like I don't have to report you after all. Someone is going to stop you, Comrade Division Commander." His tone, though slightly calmer, was laced with disappointment. He relayed everything Major General Rokossovsky, commander of the 9th Mechanized Corps and their direct superior, had just told him. Army Commander General Rokossovsky just called. "Our offensive on the town of Brod isn't working, and progress is poor. But friendly units attacking from Lutsk to Dubno are also getting hammered by the Germans' combined air and ground tactics. They're pulling back to defensive positions. Comrade Rokossovsky ordered our division to pull back our scattered forces immediately and prepare a tactical defense against a German counterattack. Intelligence indicates the Germans have thrown everything they have into this fight, even moving the entire 4th Air Force from the southern sector to the Lutsk-Brod front. Without air support, we can't hold out against that many German planes." The order didn't surprise or baffle Cherniv. In fact, it seemed to ease his inner turmoil. "All right, if that's the order, we follow it. Tell Sergei and Mayakov to pull the remaining offensive units back from the German positions. We have to get them out before the German armor cuts them off." That the white-hot battlefield, raging under heavy artillery fire for most of the day, finally quieted as the Soviets made a temporary retreat, their offensive exhausted. But the Germans, having weathered the initial assault, weren't about to let the opportunity pass. As the sun set, a powerful counterattack was brewing. Chapter 49 Eyes of Blood. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With a trembling hand, he wrenched open the hatch above him, putting every ounce of strength he had left into it. Malyshenko, who'd been commanding his T-34 76 tank all day, fighting tooth and nail, was bone-tired. Every muscle ached, and his energy was completely drained. A bloody gash above his right eye, still oozing because he hadn't had a chance to treat it, made him look even worse as he stumbled out of the turret. "Sir, watch out. Oh, God, medic. Somebody get a medic, quick." Kirill scrambled out of the turret after him, jumping nimbly to the ground. Knowing his commander was in bad shape and couldn't wait, he rushed forward, raised his own exhausted arms, and supported the swaying Malyshenko, yelling for help. Most of the surviving members of the Soviet 20th Tank Division, who'd spent the entire day in a brutal, grinding armored battle, were just as spent as Malyshenko's crew. The lucky ones who'd made it through the day's fighting were either physically shattered or nursing injuries. They were in no condition to help, barely able to stand themselves, let alone respond to Kirill's shouts. Forcing his heavy head up, Malyshenko glanced around at their position. Seeing his comrades were in rough shape and needed rest, he didn't ask for more. He straightened his back and spoke to Kirill, who was still holding him up. "I'm okay, Kirill. Just a scratch on my eye. I'll be fine after a sleep. Stop yelling. Can't you see everyone's dead on their feet?" Kirill, seeing his commander's pale face and knowing he was pushing himself, dug in his heels. "No, sir, I can't just let you go without medical attention. If you keep this up, I'm dragging you to the field hospital right now." Malyshenko, exhausted, half his face bloody and pale, knew he couldn't argue with Kirill, who was in much better shape. The burning sensation from the wound above his eye was getting worse. He finally gave in and, supported by Kirill, staggered toward the temporary field hospital behind the 20th Tank Division's lines. Although preparations for the field hospital had started before the Soviet attack, it was still a temporary setup, thrown together after a hasty march. Its capacity and resources were nowhere near what a regular hospital in a city or town could offer. Leaning on Kirill's shoulder, Malyshenko opened the nearest tent as the sun set and stepped inside. Before he could say anything, blood from the wound trickled into the corner of his mouth. Kirill, breathing hard and agitated, immediately shouted at the busy Soviet medical staff. "Doctor! I need a doctor. My commander's seriously injured. He's an officer, a captain. Somebody help him." Maybe it was the emphasis on Malyshenko's rank that did the trick. A Soviet military doctor, who'd been directing the nurses carrying the wounded to the operating table, turned at the sound of Kirill's voice and saw the blood on Malyshenko's face. Without hesitation, he strode toward them. "Captain, can you talk? If so, describe your injuries." "Okay, doctor. I'm Captain Malyshenko, commander of the 1st Company, 1st Battalion of the 1st Tank Regiment. I hit my eye on the gun sight during the battle. I didn't think it was serious, but it keeps bleeding. Can you take a look?" After hearing Malyshenko's short but detailed explanation, the doctor pulled a small medical flashlight from his coat pocket. Click, a bright beam shone on Malyshenko's eyelid, lighting up his eyeball. The doctor leaned in, peering through his glasses to examine the wound carefully for a few seconds, then turned to an assistant. "Lisa, chair and suture kit, now." A minute later, supported by Kirill, Malyshenko sat in the operating chair. He could still feel the heat welling up in the corner of his eye. He raised his hand, stopping the doctor who was about to start cleaning the wound. "Doctor, before you start, I need to know what's going on with my eye. Is it bad?" Holding the surgical scissors and alcohol-soaked cotton swabs, the doctor, a man in his late 50s with round-rimmed glasses, told Malyshenko the truth. "Captain, your upper eyelid has a 6-inch gash. It's not a shallow cut. That's why it keeps bleeding. As for how serious it is, it's not great, but it's not a disaster. After we disinfect, clean, and suture the wound properly, you should be back on the battlefield in about a month, give or take." Malyshenko stared in disbelief, thinking he misheard him. The words burst out before he could stop them. "A month?" Chapter 50 tomorrow. You are listening at novelfull.audio. At first glance, a month might not seem that long, especially in peacetime. It could even be called fleeting, but for Malyshenko, knowing a German counterattack was coming, a whole month was an eternity he couldn't afford. "Doctor," he said, "I'm a junior officer, a tank company commander. Those fascist invaders are still on our soil. I can't just give up because of a little scratch. I have a duty to my country." He paused. "If possible, I need you to find a way for me to keep using my right eye while it heals. I really can't leave the front lines. Please." The doctor frowned, clearly troubled by Malyshenko's sincere words. He thought for a moment, then replied, "I don't know much about how tank units fight, but can't you use your left eye, Captain?" Malyshenko wasn't surprised by the question. "You don't understand, doctor. Every detail of how we operate in those tanks requires perfect coordination between man and machine. Just using my other eye to aim would seriously mess up that connection and hurt our combat effectiveness. It's like asking someone who's written with their right hand for decades to suddenly switch to their left. Sure, they might be able to do it, but their writing would be slower and messier." Even though he didn't grasp all the technical jargon, the doctor understood the point. He sighed, helpless. "Captain, I hear what you're saying, but as a doctor, I have to warn you. Your right eye needs proper treatment. If it doesn't get it, you could go blind from an infection or other complications. Worse, the infection could spread to your left eye, and then you'd have problems way beyond a simple stitch." Malyshenko fell silent, absorbing the information. After a moment, he looked up, almost pleading. "Then, could you just bandage the top part of the wound after the operation? As a tank soldier, my right eye is critical. Doctor, I can't do without it." "All right." Hearing the desperation in Malyshenko's voice, the doctor gave in. He knew how powerful willpower fueled by conviction could be. He nodded slowly. "I understand, Captain. Don't worry, I'll take care of it." After receiving local anesthesia, Malyshenko sat still, his left eye open. As he watched the doctor work quickly, carefully stitching his wound, he saw a side of war he'd never truly witnessed before. More and more Red Army soldiers were carried into the field hospital, some supported by comrades, others on stretchers. The constant moans and cries of pain created a sense of hopeless despair. The already understaffed and undersupplied hospital was now overwhelmed. The crowded tent was a chaotic scene of white uniforms rushing around. For the first time, Malyshenko, fresh from the front lines, truly felt the horror and lasting effects of war. People in peacetime celebrate wartime heroes, but wartime heroes just want peace. Some things, he thought, you have to experience for yourself to really understand. Asterisk clink dash star, the surgical scissors, stained with Malyshenko's blood, landed in a metal tray. The doctor, having finished the operation, adjusted his glasses and began organizing his tools. Congratulations, Captain, the operation went well. As we agreed, I've only bandaged the upper part of your eyelid with a specially cut piece of gauze. Just be careful to protect the wound, and with your youth, you'll be back to normal soon. Malyshenko grabbed a small, blood-flecked mirror from a nearby cabinet and examined his face. The unfamiliar, yet determined face staring back didn't seem too disturbed. The treated wound was neatly bandaged, at least, in his opinion, it wasn't a big deal. He replaced the mirror and slowly rose from the chair. He felt mostly recovered. About to thank the doctor, he turned to find the man had already disappeared into the busy crowd. Oh well, I'll thank him later if I get the chance. He walked out, followed by Kirill, who had been waiting patiently. Kirill, seeing Malyshenko was steadier, no longer offered assistance. Malyshenko reached out and opened the tent flap. The bright orange sunset hung low on the horizon. What's next, sir? Kirill asked. Malyshenko, his right eye bandaged from eyelid to forehead, gazed at the sunset with renewed resolve. Clear your head, and get ready to kill more Germans tomorrow.